Okay, thank you very much for joining us for another Let's Chat Phys Ed, and I'm delighted to have Dr. Rachael Buchanan-Jefferson from Charles Sturt University with us today, joining from the other side of the world, the wonders of modern tech, and we're just going to have a chat about various things. So before we jump into our conversation proper, thank you so much for your time, Rachael, and for people who are not familiar with your work, could you give us a brief, well, it doesn't have to be brief, you could give as full as you want, an introduction into your work, what's inspired you, anything you want to bring to people's attention.
Sure, I guess I'm well known for my skills and specialism in physical education more than anything. I'm a dance specialist. I trained at Chelsea School of Human Movement in Brighton Polytechnic long ago, 3 decades now. Did a couple of years in the comprehensive system in Essex, and decided I really didn't enjoy that at all. And I applied for a job in Switzerland, and I stayed there for a long time, 13 years. Became head of physical education in the International School of Geneva. I loved it there. Then I came back for family reasons mainly, and I spent 9 years at Bath Spa University, where I worked in the postgraduate primary, and I was the only physical education specialist. And I also taught on the performing arts degree in the undergrad there as well, which was sort of like that combination. It was really nice, of dance and phys ed, but for all ages and stages really. And then I came out here into Australia 9 years ago now, and I work at Charles Sturt University in New South Wales, which is on the border of Victoria and New South Wales. We're about 3 hours drive from Melbourne. It's a lovely regional area, and during that time of all of that, I also did a lot of international consultancy work, and have been very privileged to have worked at an international level, writing national curriculum in Kazakhstan, in Mongolia, Egypt, that's about it, I think, for Cambridge Assessment International Education, and have loved every part of that, and more recently worked with UNICEF and Montrose on a sports inclusion project that was working in a very deprived area in Myanmar, and looking at how we could raise everybody's awareness of inclusion, particularly on the level of ethnicity.
Well, what a wonderful and varied career, really spanning the globe, and I'm sure leaving quite a legacy where you go. And it'd be great if we can explore some of the themes that you've raised in your introduction. And just can you just tell us a little bit more about your work at Charles Sturt, and who do you teach, and who are your students, and what do they tend to go on to, etc.?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mix. I started out with a title of lecturer in human movement studies, health and PE. And I worked here for the first 3 years or so. I was working between 2 campuses in regional Australia, which is far more of a low socioeconomic area, where I worked primarily in the early years and primary degree, and went from campus to campus. So I went to a place called Wagga Wagga, which is about an hour and a half's drive, lovely name, from Albury. And I was doing that regularly, going from Wagga to Albury as the phys ed and health specialist on those degrees. And then they decided to disband and restructure everything, as they do in universities. And basically the School of Human Movement Studies, where I worked, was disintegrated and moved into the School of Education and the School of Exercise and Sports Science. And I had to choose which way I wanted to go. and obviously being an educationalist at heart, I opted for the School of Education. And since then, there's been much less PE because it's tended to be sort of on another campus. And so I migrated really, and it was a joyous thing in the end, and I've really enjoyed it. And I'm actually teaching more dance now, and I'm actually running a five campus creative arts subject. I have a strong background in the other arts anyway, and I'm like a team leader for all these campuses, and I've designed subjects around creative arts. And I've also taken on, instead of so much PE, I've moved into the area of professional teaching, and developed again some brand new subjects that are online. And also, this is even pre-COVID, we're a big provider of online education across Australia, and those sort of look at professional aspects, such as, you know, certain themes that the course needs to have, such as inclusion and so on. So I've designed subjects around well-being and inclusion and so on within the kind of what they call the professional teaching subjects.
And that's great stuff, and really interesting work in what must be such a wonderful context. With you must be learning so much about the challenges that your students face and what's applicable and appropriate in the schools that they then go to work in. And you mentioned that you trained at the iconic Brighton school, Chelsea School of Movement, which moved to Brighton many years ago. And many people, and you've also flagged up a couple of times that I guess in PE circles you're a bit of an anomaly in that you're an artist and you're a dancer, and Brighton was world famous for that very specific approach, really an emphasis on aesthetics and the body as an art form, using the body as an art form. So how did that initial, your first degree, how do you think that shaped your outlook and philosophy as you moved through your career?
Yeah, I just look back on those times, and it was in the 1980s that I trained. I look back on those times as a really rich kind of immersion into the body and what the body's capable of. I mean, I'm good friends with Liz Taplin, and we often have discussions around how good our courses were when we trained in physical education. And I was telling her the other day, I said, you know, really we covered the breadth. You know, we did the science, we then were able to do the specializations. I focused on aesthetics and the body and dance and choreography, analysis, all of those aspects. So we went in sort of thinking we were just going to go down the sort of education PE route, but what we ended up doing was having this huge breadth of possibilities. We looked at neurology and information processing, anatomy, all of those things that, you know, that's science heavy stuff that we do in PE degrees. But then in our third year, we were able to specialize, and that's when I dropped everything and I went down the dance route. And that's when, you know, my passion and my love, because I danced since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and I was able to actually become this specialist in dance and be able to take that out into schools with me. I had one lecturer called Graham McPhee, and he was an aesthetics lecturer, and he was utterly inspiring for me. Lots of other students didn't really understand him, but I just sort of sat there at the front of the class and lapped up every single word that he said. And that he did a lot of work around the body and how it was constructed in a movement space. And so I guess that's where my interest in the body began.
And in light of a really recent, actually, the last few days, Twitter conversation around activity or area specialists within physical education,
Yeah.
You easily marry the two concepts because you refer to and draw upon your movement specialism, but also very much identify as a physical educator. As you said, when you were faced with the choice at university, your heart was always in education. And then you've published a book on fundamental movement skills. So explain the journey, or how do you see the journey from a really solid appreciation and understanding of the body in a movement space, and then looking at FMS? How do you see those two merge, and the importance of FMS in your work?
Yeah, good question. I think that there is often this split, as we know, of body and mind, but we also have a split in terms of pedagogical splits. And I think that those in PE have become a lot more explosive and dynamic, and there's a lot more debate around it than there was 20 years ago when I first was teaching, PE. In that first 10 years or so, we just accepted that we all had these activity-driven curriculum. And that was what we called traditional, and we learned how to do that at college. I was at Brighton Poly, and so we just replicated that, and we went into schools, and then we just replicated the teaching and the organization of the curriculum around, even in England, where I taught for at least 2 years, around seasons. So you did your dance and your gymnastics in the winter, and then you did your winter games, your rugby, your football, your netball, your hockey, etc. in that winter space, in hopefully little gym skirts with pleats. The girls, not the boys, the girls. And the boys all went off. My twin brother would go off and do football and all the kind of boyish activities, while the other girls, like myself, were siphoned off into these more feminine pursuits of netball and field hockey. We were all allowed to do athletics, and this is the way I was schooled. This is the way I was taught at university, and this is the way I just reproduced and reconstructed that in teaching. And I began to question it a lot when I was in Switzerland, because there was no curriculum. When I got there, everyone was just teaching how they wanted, and there was no Ofsted or any, lucky them, no inspectorate, etc. And so we could be really flexible and playful with what we taught. And as I was very much interested in pedagogy and still starting out there with my own thoughts, I just started being very playful with what we were offering children. And my colleagues, 2 male colleagues who were game specialists, loved it. And they said, yeah, let's go with it. And you can help us design a new kind of way of doing things. And I surveyed the girls, and I interviewed them, and I found out what was going on in their kind of daily physical activity or not, and what we might be able to include, and so on. And I wrote an article on it a few years after being there, and I called it Feminizing Physical Education. And it was there that my kind of love about gender. I'd always felt a bit annoyed that my twin brother had been able to play basketball and I never could, and it was there that this interest in gender inclusion, making sure that teenage girls particularly felt as though they were being listened to, playing around with their choice of uniforms, which activities they wanted to develop, and rewriting the curriculum with children's input. So from a very, very strengths-based approach, that's when things really sort of took off for me on a pedagogical level. And I said, you know what, I'm actually quite good at this. And the curriculum writing is something that I enjoy. It's motivating, and I feel as though I'm making a difference. It gives me purpose in PE. And that's when I decided, sort of when I went back to England, I said, I have to go into that space of influencing teacher education in some way.
Well, and so it's really interesting listening to you, and lots of the things that you're talking about are still so relevant. Talking about the critical experiences, the professional experiences that you had that made you reassess and reevaluate. Loads of talk about student voice and co-constructing, as we might call it these days, curriculum and experiences. And of course, running through all of that is gender and inclusion, which we'll jump onto soon. And so just how do you, if we go back to fundamental movement skills sitting within that.
Oh, yeah. I forgot that.
Okay. So, yeah, how do you see the importance of that and the challenges for teachers? It's normally associated with younger children. And personally, I think that's probably a misconception. Where has that work taken your thinking and indeed your applied thinking?
Yeah, thanks for the reminder. I think where that started for me, my mum was a primary teacher, and I remember doing, and it's a long time ago, but I've still got it somewhere in my archive. I remember doing a child study, and I looked at one of her primary children's fundamental movement skills across time, and it was a motor development project. And this was kind of like normal. People did this in PE. We looked at primary, didn't we? And we worked out what goes on at a secondary level. And it was a standard part of PE degrees in those days anyway. And I remember getting a really high mark for it. And I remember just thinking, wow, this is such an interesting space, because I'd got to know the child. I'd done research with him. I'd had little practices with him. I'd created ball games, and I'd done hopping and skipping and dancing and everything. And I'd photographed it all, and I'd annotated all those photographs, and it became a real interest. And then when I went to Switzerland, after I'd got qualified, they were always short of PE teachers in the primary space. And the secondary specialists that I was working with were like, oh gosh, you don't want to do this. You really don't want to do this. This is just like a horrible experience. You'll have to forget everything you're trained in and start, rolling around on the floor with them. And I was like, oh, that's all right. I'm up for rolling around the floor with kids, And so that's where the passion and the kind of hands-on experience began. And I actually opted to take grades 1 to 3, and they were like, oh, you are going to regret this, you don't want to be working with 4 or 5-year-olds. Anyway, I loved it. And because of the dance experience that I had, I was able to, it really changed the way I didn't teach activity-based anymore. I just ended up doing all these wonderful kind of movement-oriented skipping and galloping and hopping and jumping activities, bringing music in, and just began to teach, also working with the teachers in a very cross-curricular way, asking them what they were doing in class, joining up and linking up that thematically through a movement space and so on. And in the end, I became known as the PE teacher who taught these tiny little tots. And I missed out all the grotty adolescents in the middle. And I taught the top students, like the grade 11 and 12 and 13, because that's where I was able to teach the dance and the specialized activities, yoga and things like that. So I missed out all of these other grades in the middle for quite a number of years. And then when I went back to England, I see it as none of these things are ever coincidences, really. The lady who I shared an office with was working with a group, which are no longer there anymore, in Perth, Western Australia. And it was called STEPS Professional Development. And she was doing this whole literacy training with this particular company who were from Western Australia. And I said to the lady who came in to visit her, I said, do you have anything on movement or competence or whatever? And she said, actually, we do, but it's a very minor part of what we do. And I said, do you ever offer a course, like in fundamental movement skills? She said, yes, we do. I'll keep in touch. Anyway, lo and behold, she got back to me. And then I went and trained with her Australian consultant called Pip Lynch. And she was the representative in Australia. And I loved it. And the reason I loved it is because it wasn't from this very, very science, what I call scientific functionalism. It wasn't from that basis. It was actually very similar to what I'd done at university, which was based on the early years mentality of holistic development, working with family, working with community, making sure that the schools linked up their thinking, and also heavily Reggio influenced as well. And in that sense, sort of all those languages of children that we talk about. And I said, wow, this is awesome. I love it. I want to offer this to my students at Bath Spa. And so I went and I trained as a facilitator, so that I could offer these courses to students at Bath Spa, which I did. And I dropped those qualifications into a subject that I wrote called Health and Movement in Young Children. And it just exploded. Everybody wanted to do this subject because they were all out throwing balls and they were writing research projects about their own children, and they were engaging with children in kindergarten, and they were getting them, they were observing their kindergarten kids that they were working with, and then bringing that in and writing PowerPoint, presentations and portfolios. So I became kind of really well known for this FMS specialism because of that sort of cycle of events, really. And then cheeky me, I went to the lady in Swindon and I spoke with her, and I said, if you ever want a consultant for England, I said, I'm your lady, okay. And a few months later, she got back to me and said, yeah, well, we'll have you, we'll train you. And so I trained up with these Irish, other two Irish ladies, and we became the UK consultants, and they focused their work in Ireland. And I sort of led these facilitator courses all over England. And loved it. And the only reason I stopped it was because the company decided they weren't going to run those any of those courses anymore. But I did, before they did that, I did win a grant to go over to Perth and interview the course writers. And I got very involved in the research side of things, started writing regular papers, and then that led to my book, which was based on it's called Fundamental Fun. It's play-based theory, and it's called 132 Activities to Develop Fundamental Movement Skills. And that gave me, established credence as a fundamental movement skills, not only consultant, but as a solid author in the field as well.
So even in the title, there's two really it gives an indication of where your values are at and what you value. So would you mind sharing why you think a focus on fundamental movement skills is important, and why you want to marry that with play? When I see a lot of primary school and early years practice that is supposedly developing fundamental movement skills, one of the things that saddens me, I suppose, is the how frequently children are put into spaces that are very functional, they're very decontextualized, basically standing still, rolling a ball to each other, or learning, quote unquote, the basics in a very dry way. And it strikes me that we take the best thing around movement and we bin that and we strip it back to like the functional essence. You've got to try and get the ball from here to there, and this is how you do it. And once you've got that, you'll move on to the next bit, which is a little bit more movement involved. But you've gone out of your way to inform practitioners that, one, children need to have a solid foundation in fundamental movement skills. So please explain why you think that's essential, and two, why should that happen through play?
Yeah, not many people are working in this space at all. I think primarily because of the fact that a lot of the fundamental movement skills experts are secondary trained, and they might not necessarily have primary training at all. And as I say, I went and I got that, and I made sure that I was embedded, but I also had 13 years of working with young children. So that gave me a bit of a head start on the level of how children learn holistically. And I was able to drop some of those conventions around the technocratic side of teaching fundamental movement skills. And there are lots of authors who talk about that. And I love that work because it begins to kind of shine a light on the fact that we, as physical educationists, we have a tendency to veer towards this, you know, sports as techniques, as David Kirk says, this sports skill model. And what we do is when we work with young children, we just literally just slide it down on the conveyor belt and drop it into the early years space. And you see, that's all wrong for me. It's as you said, it becomes dry, it becomes dull, it becomes very formalized, and that's not the way children learn at that age. So I've spent many years listening to early years and primary practitioners as a lecturer, as a teacher, as a parent, etc., and tried to work out, you know, and with my own two children as well, and tried to work out, you know, what best fits the majority of children. And yeah, for me, I don't understand why there is this divide between play, which is an accepted theory of learning in the early years in primary space, and everybody goes, yes, we should all be playing. And then you have PE, and I'm like, where is this ever going to intersect? Why do we have this divorce between these? We're saying that early years should be engaging in more play, and in the same breath we're saying, yes, but PE is different. PE is where we need to learn the skills. And so my work is all about that. You know, people talk about being a pracademic. I quite like that terminology. It's about using the theory and synthesizing that with the practice. And what I try to do is say, why are we doing this? Why are we actually translating the way we teach in secondary to primary? And the only reason I can think of, having talked to many people in this space, is because it's how it's done. There's no other reason. There's no research, there's no neurological evidence base to say that children should learn skills in this way. So why are we doing it that way? It becomes just a matter of tradition. That is all. So I mean, you know, my PhD is based on Foucault and power and why we do what we do. And so I'm like, forget the tradition. Let's start again. And so I often, you know, on Twitter, I often use those explosive GIFs where there's fire and explosions and things, because I believe we need to explode this space. We need to shake it up. We need to rattle it. And we need to actually understand that early years in primary practitioners can teach us a lot about children. And actually we come down, I've seen so many top-down models with, I'm a specialist in PE, and I know better than you going on. No, that's not the case at all. We need to sit side by side and understand that they're the experts with that age group. And when you come with that respectful understanding of their skills and their expertise, that's, you know, it might make you feel uncomfortable. You might not want to be doing it, but that's where we best learn. And so that's why I come at, you know, the fundamental movement skills from that point of view, which is, let's listen to the play theories, let's listen to the play experts, understand why that's going on, and let's modify what we're doing. So it's a play, teach, play model. It's not about disbanding skill teaching. It's about adapting skill teaching, making it inclusive, making it meaningful, making it purposeful, but at the same time recognizing, you know, the expertise of these early years and primary practitioners.
What a lovely answer, Rachel. Thank you, and so much to think about there. And yeah, I mean, I've always been a really strong advocate for play as a really rich learning space, and I actually turn it the other way and think, and maybe, you know, to coin your phrase, that we need to explode the notion that play is an early years thing, and I'm not sure when it's ever not appropriate for a learning context,
Nice.
all the way through to adults. But certainly key stage 3 and 4, it should still be play rich as far as I can see, and it's, you know, it poses such brilliant problems for kids to solve, for teenagers to solve. You've been playing whatever game it is, whether it's formal, informal, teacher directed, student directed, and in the investigation of the problems that play environment solves, as you say, tees up such great learning conversations, and I love that. And actually, we modeled, we used a very similar model. You called it play, teach, play, and we in our teacher education, we were really strong advocates for something that, again, I stole from primary practitioners, although of course I've been aware of the play practice US model, but I saw a primary practitioner use many years ago, well, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago, use cold task, warm task in teaching poetry in Key Stage 2, when the pupils were asked with very minimal instruction and input to write a poem. And then they did really rich investigation and exploration of what makes really good poetry, what the poetry techniques that are used, what's the nuance of poetic language. And then they revisited their first draft. And I'm not claiming that there's anything ground-shatteringly new on that, but applying that to PE, it's just, in teacher education, we arrived at the position that we're not prescribing this, but this is the default model that we're going to use. And as a student teacher, if you want to come away from that, fine, but what's your professional justification for doing that? And we found that that's so applicable actually to pretty much all the activities that we deliver that tend to constitute physical education, whether it be aesthetic, whether it be games-based activities or any other movements. So yeah, lots of commonality there, but I really loved listening to your answer. Thank you.